The last few T-Rex Labs videos have been about radio equipment and gathering intelligence by looking at different signals with software-defined radios, both that you can buy and also a few that we designed speculatively, things that may be potentially available to you in the future. But today we're going to talk about signals intelligence as a wider discipline. Welcome back to T-Rex Talk. Today we're going to talk to a friend of mine, someone that I've known for a while who happens to have a background in signals intelligence, but you probably know him as the guy who runs the Wasson Watch company. Paul Brown, welcome to the show. I'm sure we'll talk about watches at some point, but let's start off talking a little bit about signals intelligence. And maybe the best way to get into this is your background, what you used to do in, ways that don't get you in trouble by revealing details.
Yeah, well, first, thanks for having me on the show, Isaac. It's a real pleasure to be here. Certainly love the opportunity and love what you guys do. Just all the interesting topics you get into are certainly fun to watch. And I love the topic of SIGINT with my background, but I'd love to talk about that. I joined the Marine Corps, enlisted in 2005. And oddly enough, when I first joined, I went to go into the infantry, and then I got the opportunity to take this weird test called the Defense Language Aptitude Battery in boot camp, and ended up doing well enough on that to go to language school and got the MOS of cryptological linguist. It was a 2674 cryptological Spanish linguist, actually. And so, long story short, I ended up at a place called the Texas Cryptologic Center in San Antonio, which is part of the NSA. And a lot of people don't know this. The NSA is actually NSA CSS. So it's CSS part stands for, I'm blanking on this. But
that's how secret it is.
Yeah, that's how secret it is. I had this whole thing in my mind before, but this makes me look bad, but I have to I have to look it up. Central Security Service. So the CSS part actually refers to the uniformed component of the NSA, right? So you have a bunch of NSA civilians, including employees and contractors, but then you have a lot of military personnel who are working at the NSA. And so that I was attached to the NSA as a Marine, and got to get into all kinds of signals intelligence work. You got to deploy to the Middle East. And I got a really great view of it from a training perspective as well as a practitioner. Most of my time in that world was very much in the analysis and reporting field. So I got to learn a little bit about collections, but I wasn't involved in collections. And collections is where you get into the more technical aspects of signals intelligence, right? But you have a lot of the stuff you've talked about using these different devices that would oftentimes be on the collection side. People take that information, it gets sent down the pipeline, and it ends up with the analysts who are looking at the information, maybe interpreting the information and writing the reports on it. That's where I was in the supply chain, if you will.
Yeah. And how big does, or rather, how long does the supply chain get? Obviously, there's stuff that happens in theater on a really rapid basis. So the chain is pretty short between gathering intelligence and taking action on intelligence. But then there's stuff that goes through, years, months or years of the process. How long does that supply chain get in terms of people and offices and so forth?
I mean, any given information can filter through dozens of layers. And even in theater, I'm thinking about it, any given information that's actioned very quickly. You could have collection that occurs, say, on day one, and on day 1 or 2 or 3, it's being actioned. That could go through 4, 5, 6, 7 layers, essentially. Yeah. Where there's little touch points, very, very small touch points, but a lot of layers and a lot of sometimes, this is just like it is in the rest of the world. sometimes there's not a lot of value add in some of those layers. It's just someone taking
Yeah.
someone else's report and kind of copying it and putting their own unit logo on it and then passing it up the chain. So now it's their report, and it came from the previous person, and they're just justifying their existence.
Yeah. Did you ever read, this is completely related, but also a rabbit trail. Did you ever read Hunt for Red October, the original book?
Yeah.
So there is technically this is an internet version. It's a very old book. Tom Clancy was doing this stuff a long time ago, but it was within the circles in DC. There was an internet. People wrote stuff on the internet. So there was an internet version of Hunt for Red October that was like the realistic version, where some CIA agents wrote what it's actually like, and it was a lot of different people putting their logo on Jack Ryan's report and calling it their own. But there was also, multiple layers of analysts telling him, like, oh, you've got to finish this 800-page report on where the Soviet Navy is getting its brass buttons for its admirals, because that will reveal their plans for the fleet if we just have the data and you just write up the report long enough. And you've been working on it for 2 years, so it's really time for you to deliver this. And he's like, no, there's this rogue submarine we have to catch. Like, no, but the button report. You must finish the button report. It was a 2-year project, and we're getting close to the deadline. So I don't know if that brings back memories for you, or
it's like
flashbacks.
It's like any other large organization with a lot of bureaucracy and a lot of bureaucrats, individuals who are devoted to that sort of bureaucratic method, and they want their checks in their boxes. Like whatever the thing is that is the check in the box that we have said this is a requirement, they want to make sure that those things happen. And so you do get a lot of things where you can sort of see intuitively that the priority ought to be report or collect a report on this, but like, no, this is what we're doing because this is what we do, and we're not going to question that or buck against that. One of the worst examples I ever heard in the theater that I was in, I didn't experience this directly, but I had a friend who was in Iraq, and they were reporting on some of the limitations of the Iraqi military that was being trained up and some of the vulnerabilities there. And there came a point where they just got feedback from higher up, like, we don't want to hear that. You guys need to stop reporting on that. And that was a case of history repeating itself. That's what happened in Vietnam. When there were individuals on the ground trying to report on some of the limitations and vulnerabilities of the South Vietnamese army, saying, hey, when we roll out of here, they're really not gonna be able to stand up to North Vietnam. And there just came a point where, like, listen, you're really hurting our efforts here to try to get everyone on the same page and make this thing happen. We're just going to have to ask you to stop reporting that. And so intelligence is supposed to roll uphill to come from this very sort of neutral standpoint. But often there's feedback that's actually coming back that's driving intelligence. And it is good to have leadership to say, these are what our priorities are. Like, this is something we need to know. This is a knowledge gap, and this is our knowledge requirement. But when it comes to, we'll say, editorializing on what the truth of the matter is, that's where it starts to get you in trouble. And everyone asks, how did this happen? Like we saw with the withdrawal from Afghanistan. Well, how did this happen? It's like, well, probably there were very early indicators that it was going to go that way, that were coming for a long time, that eventually just got suppressed. And, how did this happen? Well, just look at what happened.
Yeah. Well, and this is kind of an interesting thing. You've mentioned that these bureaucratic systems get put in place. So those are kind of static structures. The data coming up from the bottom is going to be pretty apolitical and pretty neutral, because a lot of times you're gathering information, you're not sure of the meaning. That's why it needs to be analyzed. So if it hasn't been analyzed and it's raw data that doesn't have meaning, it's very hard to politically nudge it in a direction, because you don't even know what it's going to be. But once you get up to the top, you start to run into people who are not necessarily experienced field guys or entrenched bureaucrats. You start to get into some political territory. So is that where most of the political stuff happens, is higher up in the appointee air?
The higher up you go, the closer you get to that, the more I would say consolidated that becomes. But it doesn't necessarily have to just start in the appointee realm. Even below that, you're going to have some very high up people who've been around for a long time who sort of know which side of the fence they're on. You know, they recognize what kind of people they are. They recognize, like kind of what their thoughts and ideas of what should happen. And they're the kinds of people who will, kind of long-term be feeding stuff in such a way that they know where it's going to end up, which kind of people would be their allies in the appointed realm and so on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. There was a blog many, many years ago called Weapons Man, and I deeply appreciated Weapons Man's take on this. He was, I believe, Green Beret, but he had a background of one foot very firmly in the direct action combat side of the Cold War, and then the other foot pretty firmly planted in the intelligence side. And so he had some pretty interesting observations about the ways that things were developing, and the bright young things in the intelligence services were no longer really connected to the field people. And the mighty old Tuskers, the guys that had gained their experience during the Cold War, were kind of all gone. So the way that the bright young things climb the ladder is pure politics within the blob at this point. So it's kind of interesting to get his read on that based on his background. But should we keep staying political, or should we go into like some practical signals intelligence and OPSEC and communication stuff?
I mean, I could talk about politics all day long. But, as long as we're sort of on the topic, there is an intersection of politics and OPSEC with the recent signal news that came out and everyone's been discussing over the last couple of days. So we could definitely discuss that. Let's
dive into that a little bit. For those of you that don't know, Pete Hegseth and J.D. Vance and others were on a signal chat, which, according to The Atlantic, has top secret war plans inside of it. And somebody from The Atlantic was in the chat. And the headline is, of course, that he was sent top secret war plans. And there's been all kinds of pushback on the internet from different groups. Everybody has an opinion about this. I'm curious about your opinion, because everyone has talked about everything from this is 5D chess, 5D chess to find a mole. This is not actually war plans. And then on the other side, like Pete Hegseth is not smart enough to know how to use a phone. This any take has been taken at this point.
And there's so much noise out there, and there's so much speculation, and some of what we may do here could be speculation, but we'll try to stay away from that and try to stick to what we know or what seems to be apparent.
Atlantic reporters not smart enough to use phones, right? Yes, yeah.
The first thing is obviously we can see there's a ton of bias in how this is being discussed.
Oh, it's huge,
right? Like if you're anywhere remotely on the left, then this is the biggest scandal since Whitewater or whatever, just go back as far as you want. This is the worst thing that has ever happened. How could this ever happen? And you look at actually what the details of the chat were, and you're like, there's not like specifics being discussed there. This is the Goldberg, the reporter, I think his name is Goldberg, what he said was that, there's other information that he didn't share for national security concerns. And maybe that's true. And if that is, I'm glad he didn't share it. But it also might be that there's really not much there in terms of specifically actionable information. I don't know. Right. I don't know the answer to that. But then on the right, on our side, that I think it's a reach to say, this was a search for a mole and this is 5D chess and all this stuff. It's like, look, based on what happened, it looks like someone was typing in a name, and if you've used Signal and other apps like that, names start to populate, and you click on one, and they just hit the wrong one. I'm sure they weren't intending to put an Atlantic reporter in there. And so the question is then, like, should this have happened? Is the problem with the Signal app? Is it with the practitioners? Is it, where is the problem? And how big is the problem? Without seeing that other information that was shared, I don't know how big this leak was. Certainly, though, when you're talking about any kind of national defense information at a high level, you don't want unauthorized personnel involved in that. Certainly not Atlantic reporters. We should keep them as far away from everything as much as we can. But then, I don't know if you wanted to jump in. I'll ramble on and on.
Well, an interesting thing is, so you have experience with secure lines and secure communication technologies and dealing with information inside of SCIFs and the difficulty of even just chain of custody of information, and does it have the appropriate paperwork attached to it so that it can travel, has the right credit taker had a chance to put his logo on it quite yet so that it's allowed to go in the diplomatic pouch, like all that kind of nonsense. And we could have a long conversation with all kinds of security professionals on whether or not Signal is in fact secure. The great thing about Signal is that it is widely used, which means that it's really easy to use. The downside is that it's really easy to use, which means it's really easy to accidentally, add people to it. So there, I forget who first came up with it, but in the security world, there is this idea that security and convenience are diametrically opposed.
Absolutely.
You cannot have both.
Right.
And so if you make something as easy to use as Signal, no matter how good the algorithm is, you accidentally adding a person is still super possible. So that's kind of an interesting conversation.
And that vulnerability there, you're looking at an open ecosystem versus a closed ecosystem. And Signal, let's just say for argument's sake that Signal is a secure platform. We'll take it one step further. Let's say it's the most secure platform in the way the information is handled end to end. Let's just say that there's no vulnerabilities.
The transfer layer is unbreakable. Yes. No information is stored anywhere else. It's just, but if one end of either end or both ends are compromised, that's where your trouble is, which is also possible with any other kind of platform, even in the government space. The real vulnerability point is being an open ecosystem is that I can accidentally add people to that chain to be on one end or the other that are not supposed to be there. So for me, this seems like it should theoretically be an easy fix. We're talking about security and convenience. That if people in the intelligence community, in basically any kind of classified space in the U.S. federal government, kind of take a hard look in the mirror and recognize, hey, people are going to have conversations that we would prefer they didn't have on their phones, but we recognize they're going to, that maybe there should be a government-created app where only people who have these levels of clearances have that app. Like you have to verify it and so on and so forth. And therefore you wouldn't be able to speak to anyone outside of that particular ecosystem. Maybe such an app exists, but it's really poorly made or just really poorly adopted. Having seen some government-produced apps in my time, poorly made and poorly adopted are likely.
Yeah. So, maybe Elon Musk needs to make one of his Doge side projects, a product like that is actually well adopted within the government. And you still place some parameters and guidelines around it. Like, look, this is a way for us to, talk about maybe not the absolutely most sensitive information, but information that we don't want ending up going to an Atlantic reporter, while also, also giving us some level of cover, right? But then you still like, hey, if I'm going to send a complete top secret with, compartmentalized information kind of report, I'm not going to send it over that platform. That still needs to happen on the appropriate networks, going through the appropriate channels. It's easy to jump into solutions too quick, but I think I'm slow to overly judge the individuals in that conversation because I recognize how fast-paced their workload is, how many different things they're working on at the same time, and the need to communicate swiftly and effectively to all the parties that need to be, in that conversation. And it's like, hey, you make it work. Sometimes you just have to get the job done. Does that mean improvements can't be made? No, it doesn't. The improvements can always be made.
Yeah. Another factor is Pete Hegseth, not so much, but essentially every Trump appointee is coming in to do battle with the federal government at some level. Like that was campaign promises, that is stated goals. So I can also see real hesitation on their part to let's have this conversation inside of a SCIF. Let's have this conversation inside of a government app. Let's have this conversation inside of the rules that an Obama appointee has set up for us. I can see that line of thinking as well as they're doing some of this stuff.
Oh yeah. And if Signal had been previously compromised by people on that side of things, you would have expected some of this kind of information to come out before. That would be one argument for it being a secure platform. Now, even you and I have discussed, how secure a platform is it to begin with. Earlier we said, for argument's sake, let's just say it's the most secure platform. And some people, I think, would make essentially that argument. I'm always in the skeptical camp of I just don't know. I don't know what I don't know. I would not be surprised someday if it came out there's some big backdoor, there's something, and I'm not technically proficient enough to say for sure that that's a thing or even a possibility, but I'm open to it. Absolutely.
Yeah. I will say I trust Signal a lot further than I trust anything else that I'm aware of at the moment. But the network is only as secure as the least secure Atlantic reporter that's in your group chat, so there's that.
Yeah, that's what I always say.
And then there's just my phone is not super secure. I have DJI software on here that I use to fly drones. This is an experiment phone, which means this is no longer a safe phone.
Yes.
So if I wanted to do safe Signal, then I would be running a different phone, running graphene, and I might even have a different Signal account so that I wouldn't be doing as much commingling of messages. Even if that transport layer inside of Signal with the encryption is completely foolproof, my phone is a weak link in this, and then whoever I'm talking to, once it becomes a group chat, it's just a bunch more links.
Yeah, so your phone can be exploited, and so that the actual comment, the communications intelligence within can be accessed through that. But then we get to even a broader picture in the signals intelligence world, which is your phone is also a radio frequency transmitter, right? There is a something that we can learn from you, from your phone usage, even if everything is 100% encrypted. And so that's now that's a higher up level of looking at the intelligence, not just what the message is, but where did it come from? When was it sent? What's your pattern of life look like?
Yeah. So without getting into too many details, is there anything you can talk about the pattern of life stuff? Because if, let's say, my pattern of life that you've observed from this phone is that I do almost all of my texting over just regular SMS, and I use Signal very rarely. But then suddenly one day, tons of Signal traffic. You can't read it, but you can tell by snooping into the packets. The metadata shows you that there's way less raw SMS traffic or whatever the, rich messaging system is that we're supposed to be using now, but everything still defaults to SMS. Suddenly there's tons of signal traffic, or suddenly I start using a VPN, or suddenly I start trying to hide my tracks. How easy is that to pick up on and make assumptions from?
That's a good question. I don't know that I can get into
assuming that the squints, the actual collection guys can pull that out of the deep packet inspection. How easy is it for you to make assumptions and analysis and pull drone strike coordinates out of your conclusions?
There's a lot of context there that needs to certainly be considered. But yeah, as soon as you move from like a more open platform to say a more closed one, or one that appears to be less secure to one that appears to be more secure, right there I know, like, hey, you're upping your operational security, your COMSEC, to a higher level. Is it because of specific information that you're discussing right now, or is this part of a new pattern of life going forward? And so for that, you need time. If I just look at it, okay, today suddenly that stuff increases, but then tomorrow it goes back down, maybe that indicated that there was something sensitive that you were sort of discussing in that time frame. Or maybe you got on this kick and you're like, I'm going full on OPSEC here, and then it was just really hard to stick to because of poor discipline, which is what
inconvenient.
That's what gets everyone in the end. It's what gets most people in the end. It's always less convenient. And so if you don't have a really pressing need to do it and really strong discipline and ideally really good training around it, you're just not going to do it. But the broader conversation around this is like, this is a listening device. It is a location device. It is everything. There's no OPSEC with one of these. Like and there are platforms people have made, special tailor-made phones that are supposed to be a lot better, and you can turn everything off and so on and so forth. But I think the average user isn't disciplined enough to keep it on that setting, because then you're basically carrying around a brick. If you want to use the things on it, you have to actually use the things on it. But essentially, we live in a world where we have unprecedented level of access to information about ourselves that we provide to other parties. And it's the kind of thing where if one day you woke up and there was a very, very prescient need for you to have very strong operational security, you just have to get rid of this entirely. You can't carry this around. Yeah. You can't use it anymore. And that's the world that we're in.
Yeah. And regular computers, the laptops that we're using for this podcast recording are getting worse. Like Windows 11 is much more of a modern operating system in the way that a phone is. There's lots of telemetry. There's lots of phoning home. The days of you owning a device and you telling the device what to do they feel very much in the past. To me. Yeah. The complexity of the devices is such that mere mortals can't tell the device what to do. Giant corporations running huge server farms, they manage the device. Then the device does what they tell it to do, and you get to have the device.
Yeah. So I think about application for that. I mean, if you find yourself in an enemy of the state kind of situation, like the Will Smith movie from, I think it came out in the 90s.
It was kind of groundbreaking, actually, I think.
It was. If you find yourself in that situation, like, of course, you ditch your phone and your laptop and everything, and you're on the run or whatever. Most people are never going to find themselves in that situation, right? So then I think it's like, what is the application for the average person with this information? It's like, okay, I carry around a giant SIGINT liability. What do I do with that? Because I'm not going to stop.
Right. Yeah.
Obviously, I haven't stopped. You haven't stopped. We use these every day in our daily lives. And so I think the most immediate application is: are you at least aware of like what kind of information is being shared on your apps, and what controls, if any, you may have to kind of throttle those? And or do you even want to? It just starts with knowing. And I think most people don't necessarily know.
Well, and as you mentioned, if you suddenly become security conscious, that can be a red flag as well. So slowly learning these things and slowly implementing changes and slowly taking back some responsibility over your devices is not only an option, but maybe a better option. I mean, you can't just suddenly find Gene Hackman and he fixes your security for you anymore, sadly, since he's no longer around to do that for us. But even just general awareness of stuff, I think, is really helpful. Now, I would argue that I'm unfortunately a little bit of a special case. Like, I am a terrible example. Nobody should take my advice or follow my example of operational security, because I post a video every single week and there's a podcast every single week. And my phone, if you watch my videos, is filled with side-loaded semi-experimental ham radio software that is probably not trustworthy. Yeah. And the aforementioned drone software. Like, I'm doing this so you don't have to. I'm not doing this so that you can do what I do. Yeah. So knowing more about this stuff, I think, is really good. My poor discipline and poor security practices are not what I'm hoping that people follow.
Yeah. But they're doing all kinds. I mean, people have TikTok on their phones and all kinds of good stuff.
Yeah.
But just think of like Google. Google loves data. Right. That's kind of what it uses to make money. And so Google collects and shares a ton of data. And so whether it's Google Chrome or you're on an Android platform or you use Google Mail or use Google Search, the odds that you don't come into contact with Google at all are very, very slim. So that's just one example right there, without it being a shady, weird, I don't know if there's malware on here. It's not even malware. It's just like, we're going to collect all your data. And we're going to know
the core features depend on them having all your stuff. Yeah.
Correct.
So here's a question. I have been researching buying a new vehicle. It's been a long time since I'll buy it used, but it still is going to be new enough that most of the 2018, 2019 vehicles have cell modems in them, 4G modems, that send your data to Ford or GMC or the various data collection agencies that they have contracted with. And there are ways that you can pull a fuse here or snip an antenna there. But as I've researched these, the forums that tell you how to snip the antennas and pull the fuses, there's always guys who are like, you're paranoid, and also don't bother because you already have a phone. Which I kind of understand, but where's the value in splitting these things up? Like, yes, I already have a phone, but even with my incredibly insecure side-loaded ham radio software phone, isn't it better that I close off a leak, which is all of my driving habits going straight to a separate company that isn't Google? Like, isn't it better to prune off some of these branches, even if I still have the phone?
That's a good question. I don't necessarily see the specific value in it, right? Because I think it comes from I want to kind of limit the damage, but the damage is at is kind of at 100% already. And what I mean by that is the information that's going to the car companies probably is sanitized, so it may not be tied to a specific individual, though it could be. And I don't know enough about it to say, but
well, and this is kind of the issue is right now the terms of service agreement were signed. I'm buying a used vehicle, so they were signed by whoever bought the vehicle. I don't know what they said, and I also don't get an update if they change them. Like, it used to be just we're collecting brake pad lifespan data, and now it's we're sending your data directly to the insurance companies, and your premiums go up if you record G-forces over a certain level. And the insurance company pays us $25 a month to send them this data. So of course we're going to send them the data. That's where I see that threat.
Right.
If Ford and I were partners as opposed to enemies in this, them trying to convince me to buy one of their cars
Yeah.
endeavors, I would love for them to have data about my driving habits so they will invent a better car for me in the future, in theory. I don't know that I trust Ford.
I look
though.
at their primary incentive for Ford as being to make money. Right. And so what is their interest in your data? They want to see how the vehicle is, how it's used, so they can collect more information about their customers, their target demographic, to sell better to them in the future. And they also want real-time data about the performance of the vehicle, problems that persist. So basically they've streamlined their, instead of it like, well, people take their car in and then that information is collected when there's something wrong at the service centers, and then eventually sometimes that gets reported back to corporate, and you've got these like all these steps. They just want this straight line. We can see in 10,000 of our vehicles this specific problem occurred after this many miles, and it just comes straight to us. I think that's the incentive perspective, and that's kind of how I think about the data. That's why I'm able to justify that I still have a cell phone, right? Is I can see the incentives for why they're there, and there's this sort of mutual symbiotic relationship of like, yeah, you've got all my data, but I get free email, or semi-free, because as my data storage goes up, I'm paying for that, but that's a whole other thing.
I still see some value in kind of limiting the bleed a little bit, just because stuff changes over time. Like I don't anticipate Google changing much over time, but we've seen VPNs be owned by independent companies and then they get bought by a bank or something. And it's like, oh, well, I would rather that bank not have my data. So I think that's limiting some of the data streams. I guess it also depends a lot on your threat model. Like I assume that the NSA has all of my data, but I don't think the NSA is going to be like, oh, hey, we should probably tell State Farm that this guy's driving habits are bad. Ford might tell them that. NSA probably not going to tell them that. They'll just drone strike me.
If theoretically, we'll just say theoretically, that the NSA had all your data, it would be siloed in such a way that it's not supposed to be accessed without, UCIT 18 requirements. So you need essentially a warrant or the equivalent of a warrant to get there. But the bigger vulnerability for Americans right now is the subpoena process, and just how Google and other large companies will just automatically comply. They're not our friends when it comes to that. They're friends with the federal organizations that would be issuing that subpoena. So it's like they come to Google and be like, listen, you know what, we decided we've got a thing against this Paul Brown guy, we're gonna go after him for such and such. They issue that subpoena and there's no questions asked. They're like, here you go, here's everything. And from a threat kind of perspective, that's where I have to be thoughtful. I'm not doing anything illegal, but it's why I take this. I think operating under the assumption that everyone already has all my data, that's the safest way for me to progress, because I'm going to be thoughtful. If there's something that I should not be sharing at all on let's say an unsecure platform, I'm not sharing it on any platform, right? Because I just assume every single platform is compromised. And that would be my guiding philosophy with the car thing. It's like, I'm already there. Everyone's already got all my data. If the car company wants to get it more directly, I don't really mind, because they could buy it from Google. Not the data about the car itself, but in terms of accelerometer information, G's being pulled, where I'm going, all that stuff.
Your most damaging driving statistics are already in the clear, probably.
Exactly. Yeah. They're purchasable.
Obviously, I would never speed, but if I were to speed, my phone would actually know about it somehow, just as soon as the car does.
Exactly. So, do I mind if the car company gets it like one step closer? Like, whatever. Take the data. For me to get out of this rat race of my data being both produced and accessible by just armies of people, I need to move to a cabin in the woods in North Dakota or whatever, like it's totally unconnected. And I've not chosen to do that so far. And that doesn't mean I'm certainly not discouraging anyone from taking any kind of OPSEC precautions, but that's just where it's such a big mountain of the level and degree to which our data is both being collected and exploited is incredibly high. It is incredibly high.
Well, here's a crazy question. In the past, there have been multiple surveillance platforms because there were multiple communications platforms. It was a really complicated, multi-layered thing where there were security cameras here and there were cell phone taps over here, and there was just an entire army of collection techniques that were possible. But now that everybody has these universally adopted centralized communication devices, perhaps the surveillance state is pretty narrowly focused on those things. You don't actually have to go to the cabin in Montana. You just have to turn your phone off to be kind of falling through the cracks. Like if I had an old car, no phone, I drove to work and I talked to people at work. Obviously, if they have phones in their pockets, my voice is picked up and they get ads for the things that I talk about.
Yeah.
But is the surveillance state possibly so narrowly focused on centralized phone data that I actually kind of fall into a little bit of a blind spot if I just do face-to-face communications and remember how to write long-form letters to people?
See, and I think this brings us into, which I think is a very useful piece of the conversation, the importance of recognizing the importance of fusion intelligence versus being narrowly focused on signals intelligence, human intelligence, imagery intelligence, whatever the case may be. And because practitioners of intelligence are often in one of those fields, they'll often talk up their field as being like the best. To me, it's comical.
The ultimate.
Yeah, right. To me, it's comical. Like they're human SIGINT guys always, SIGINT's the best, human's the best. That's silly. That's silly. Take a holistic approach. The best is having as many sources of intelligence, or if you think about it, let's move away from the military to like an investigative perspective, as many different sources of evidence or information about a suspect as possible. So let's say you literally get rid of your phone, get rid of your computer, drive an old car. In this, you would say you get rid of your landline or not. Maybe you keep if you have a phone landline. You don't have Wi-Fi, all of that. Well, okay, I have other information about you. I can get your home address. I can get your work address. We can get your tax returns, right? We can find your next of kin. We can figure out where they are and their work addresses and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
If we can get a human source, right, they can confirm, he's regularly at work. It could be a witting or an unwitting human source. You call someone who knows you, we can find information about you. Maybe they don't realize the reason for that information being collected. You could intercept letters potentially. You could intercept wired phone calls if you haven't gotten rid of your landline, right? So then if I want to simply just avoid signals intelligence, I can do that. But to avoid, this bigger, broader picture of people being able to track your activities, your patterns of life, your associates, and so on, that's a bigger endeavor. That's more or less impossible.
Well, and we see that that's how surveillance worked back in the 80s and the 70s. Like that was how this was done. And in some ways, there was a really interesting benefit to that, which was that kind of surveillance, like say spying on, obviously there's the international component, but even just from a domestic perspective, like when we had law enforcement guys focused on the mob, for example, it was very expensive to put tails on people. It was very time consuming to watch people's houses to see if they were coming in or going out. Wiretaps required people physically tapping wires. And so what happened was there were limited resources to put under surveillance, and it ended up being a thing that sort of self-selects to we focus on the highest the highest guy. We go for the most important guy because we don't have the infinite resources necessary to just every Italian in New York under surveillance.
Right.
The thing that we have now with centralized spyware type devices is you can do mass surveillance, and it feels like, and this could just be that the systems are being manageable, but it feels like for the most part, we see law enforcement going after the lowest hanging fruit and the easiest to get, as opposed to focusing their attention on the kingpins, because you can just wiretap everybody. You can just send out a warrant for anybody. Like, you don't have to go to a judge and be like, a random Italian guy, we'd like to discriminate against him, please, Your Honor. It's just like, no, Google will just give us all the data.
Yeah. Well, so
that's a temptation.
So I think that you tend to find with the greatest practitioners in a given field, whether it's crime or insurgency or whatever, that you have the most careful discipline to operational security, right? The guys at the top of the chain are going to be the most likely to pass messages in a cryptic form in a safe place verbally to individuals who then essentially pass it down to someone else. And the further down the chain you get, the further you get from those very careful OPSEC kind of policies and procedures. And you see that, I think, both in crime and in the world of terrorism, of insurgencies, and so on. You see guys that are really, they know their stuff and they're disciplined and they do the same thing all the time. And then you see these other guys who are they've been told what they're not supposed to do, and they just do it. They just don't care.
Yeah.
And it's great.
It's too much work.
It's too much work, and it's too much to keep track of. And then there's also, if you're not well trained, there is a lack of confidence in the information that you've been given, right? How do you trust? They're telling you not to do this. Well, why? If I don't fully understand why I shouldn't do it, then that also makes it more difficult for me to follow those OPSEC procedures. But then you also have, from a criminal perspective, there's so much corruption. And this is getting into almost like an entirely different topic. But why is crime?
Oh no, we've circled back to where we started, actually, the political side.
Yeah. Look at places like Chicago and like New York, like all these places where you just know there is tons of corruption at the highest levels. And sometimes it's not that it would be impossible to gather the necessary evidence to go after these guys. There's no, that guy, you're not going after that guy. I get a cut from that guy every week.
Right. Yeah.
He gets to stay in business, and that's a bummer. That certainly needs to be rooted out.
Yeah. So it's kind of interesting to play with all these different variables and options. But the other thing, is your threat matrix. If you are a corrupt enough mayor in Chicago, you don't have to worry about a bunch of threat matrices because you've already paid them off.
Right.
And it used to be that if you were a completely law-abiding, innocent guy, you didn't have to worry about certain threat models because they were going to look out for you.
Yeah.
And there still are lots of threat models. Like the ham radio software that I'm running on this device is not just leaking data to the NSA. In fact, I don't think it's doing that. But what it's probably doing is introducing security weaknesses in my phone that Chinese script kiddies will find because it's a piece of Linux software badly ported to Android by a radio guy and not a programmer. So. Right. There are those threats that open up as well. And so what are some of the ones that we should, and the listeners to the show be thinking about or concerned about? Are you saying that game's over, all our data's out, so we're already toast, so there's nothing we can do to fight back against crime, terrorists, or tyranny?
That's a great question. A lot of successful hacking is really about gaming human behavior. It's not. There's a lot that happens on the technical side, but there's a lot that happens on the social side. And so it's very simple things like phishing emails, right? The best probably way for people to protect their data, protect their financial information and their sensitive information, protect their email accounts and so on, is be vigilant to not click on links that come in emails as a general rule. My rule, if I get an email, is I don't click the link in the email unless I've verified that it's okay. My default is no. And I have to build the case for why I would think it would be okay to click that link. Not if you have a default, I can click links in emails unless I see a good reason not to. They're going to get you eventually, right? You're going to see an email that looks like it's from a trusted source, an individual an organization that looks like a good email, looks like it's put together the right way, same graphics that you would expect from that organization or individual, and you're going to click on that link. And you're going to enter your password, and it's going to go to whoever in Russia who steals your Bitcoin or whatever it is. And next thing you're in trouble. And so it takes discernment and patience. The same way we're entering this world of with AI and with such a high, fast-paced release of new information. I spend a lot of time on X, on Twitter, X formerly known as Twitter, not ecstasy. I just gotta make sure that's
we're old
clear.
enough that you have to clarify that it is not ecstasy, and it is also not Twitter.
I still remember that you got to be discerning with the information that you're coming across, and that's only going to become more difficult if you cannot discern if something is real or not. If there's a video that's real, if the source, the person who posted a video or specific a piece of breaking news, you're going to have a hard time not being susceptible to hackers who are trying to find your discernment vulnerabilities to gain that upper hand. That's the biggest, probably operational security lesson you could give anyone that would have an impact right now.
Yeah, and it goes deeper than that. Like, it isn't just about getting hacked, but it is just overall long form deceived. I think it is kind of fascinating that we have the most detached from reality generation ever. Like, we had postmodernism is no longer a new idea, but the current generation is so postmodernized, so believing in their own reality, their ability to reject reality and replace with something of their own. And now we have AI creating very convincing alternate images of reality. Like, this is not a good combination.
No, it's not.
It's going to be fascinating to see how this works. Throughout all of history, having a firm foundation is very, very important.
Yeah.
Probably at no other time than whatever happens next.
Well, ironically, we're in this very, maybe you could argue fake world, virtual world. But one of the most important currencies is trust.
Yes.
And I've seen that in my business is people they've gotten to know me and they've gotten to know Wasson Watch Company in a way that there's a very high level of trust because there's go ahead.
There is a high level of trust for you, but it goes beyond that. Yeah. When I was at SHOT Show this year, I was talking to a guy that I'd met over the internet, and I didn't know him in person, so I didn't really know what his personality, life, politics were. I'd only talked to him about random gun stuff, and so he was like, "Well, I'm with you on these other issues," and I was like, when you say you're with me on these other issues, what exactly do you mean? And he rolled up his sleeve and showed me his Wasson watch. And I was like, you are very much with me on these other issues. Like, not only have you built trust, but the Wasson watch ownership pool is small enough and ideologically focused enough that it is like a token of trust that you can tangibly show to other people. So
that's one of the coolest things I've ever heard.
There were three Wasson watches at SHOT Show that I know of, and one of them was a guy I already knew. Yeah. Also an intelligence guy, by the way. We can talk about him offline. But
for sure. Yeah.
But then this other guy that I only knew as an internet persona, and then I was like, oh, we have a fair amount of shared understanding, though. I can see.
Yeah, you see it right away.
This is the sort of thing, though, like this level of trust in say a James Bond novel or the old Cold War days. Like you would build a profile on a guy, you would figure out that he moves in these circles, and you would somehow get yourself a Wasson Watch so you could infiltrate into these circles.
There you go.
I do wonder that the world is so algorithmized and automated, and even the surveillance has become mass bulk operations that maybe people have lost some of that human capability here and there, except for the guys who are still human specialists.
I think we're so encased in this virtual world that there's a noticeable gap in our experience with the real, and so there's a greater craving for the real and authentic. And so what for the kind of this trust matrix, if you will, with us. What I've seen is, because what we've simply done is spoken the truth of what we believe, about Jesus Christ as King and abortion is murder, and that there's only two genders that God made and you can't change those. Like these are duh things. These are things that are absolutely true, but people crave hearing people say that, just to acknowledge you're a real human being who has a basic grasp on truth and reality. And that is what has boosted the trust that people have with us. And so what I've seen with that, as I kind of extrapolate that out to sort of a broader picture, is what makes people decide, I'm going to follow that person, I'm going to buy that product, I'm going to subscribe to this thing, is they see some level of authenticity that is very, very hard to manufacture in a fake way.
Yeah.
It's hard, and you can just see through people eventually, and it may not be immediate, but you start following someone that's fake, you're going to see it. You're going to see it and you go, yeah, this isn't legit.
And I think that you put your finger on something. You just said the three most offensive things that you can say at this time. Jesus is Lord. Abortion is murder. There's only two genders. Like those are distinctly controversial things. Like we could build a community around not liking the Disney Star Wars movies, but that's not a good enough litmus test.
Right.
Even people who are okay with Disney Star Wars could say that they aren't. But these three statements that you just made that identify your watch company, those are powerful passphrases, because there's a lot of people who just are very uncomfortable with those. Now, the crazy thing to me is two of those statements, abortion being murder and there only being two genders, 100 years ago, those were not gateposts. Those were not gatekeeping passphrases. Those were not a good test. Like Joe Stalin would have been like, yeah, of course there's only two genders. Like this would not have separated out the wheat and the chaff 100 years ago. No, it's kind of crazy that those statements are now dividing lines, clear dividing lines for folks. Even
2 decades ago for the two genders one. I mean, I remember the first time I saw, and now we're getting very far afield of SIGINT, but the first thing I ever saw.
This is kind of a data verification thing we're talking about. I think we're still kind of in the realm.
Yeah. Well, you'll certify it. In 2012, I still remember it was 2012. I read an article. I think it was on CNN. It was an online article about transgenderism, and certainly growing up, you'd heard of transvestites or cross-dressers, but that's not really the exact same thing. Those are people who are choosing to dress as the opposite sex, but they don't necessarily believe they are that. It's still crazy behavior, but you start talking about transgenderism, you're talking about people who say, no, I am this other. And you're like, no, you're clearly not. I mean, there's a real well-accepted physical characteristic here that you don't have. And when I first heard about it, I was like, it was so rare. It was so new. It's like, surely this is going to stay this super niche, almost unheard of thing. And now, again, that was 2012. So this is just 13 years later, and it's this massive thing. And you've got, gender neutral bathrooms and all kinds of crazy
stuff. It's very fascinating. Yeah. Yeah. No, I remember the Wachowski brothers directed the Matrix movies. The first one came out in 99, I think.
Yeah.
And then they shot the sequels in Australia. And I was working in the New Zealand film industry. And I was still talking to people in the American film industry. And early 2000s, they were doing and talking about stuff that Hollywood people were uncomfortable with. Like even Hollywood folks were like trying to keep some of the Wachowski activities very hush hush. It wasn't, I mean, obviously it would have been bad for film marketing.
Yeah.
Because, you're marketing the Matrix trilogy to Middle America, but I can tell you, even Australia and American Hollywood film people in the biz were uncomfortable with some of the stuff that Wachowskis were doing. So cultural changes happen fast, and I do think that as you lose your foundation and you lose your footing, and now these new super powerful AI tools come along, things are going to happen even faster than we have been seeing them. So
yeah.
Not to make an artificial subway here, but your signals intelligence, you do need to be able to verify the signals that you are receiving, the information that you're getting.
Yes.
Because you're about to, we are in a world of just, the left has talked a lot about the need to police misinformation. Look, I am opposed to government centralized verification of information and censorship. That's not what I'm talking about here. But you personally need to be able to figure some of this stuff out, because it is about to get a lot harder to figure out.
Yeah. Well, and as with anything, you need the appropriate orientation. I think of I love OODA loop. Observe, orient, decide, act. But you got to orient, and so that means basically you need a true north, you need a solid ground, you need something that I like what C.S. Lewis said. I'm going to paraphrase it because I don't think I have it exactly, but he said something of like, if you see through everything, you see nothing. If you have this worldview or this perspective that everything is up to me and my mind, and nothing is certain. Nothing is absolutely certain. I can question everything to the nth degree. You're leaving yourself in a position of vulnerability, of not having any solid ground to stand on. Like there's got to be absolute truth to which you can grasp onto and say, this is true north. This is how I'm oriented. I'm not just floating in space, and this nebulous space of my perspective is king. I think what you and I share in common there is that we know that the Bible is the absolute truth, the Word of God. And what I would encourage people, obviously anyone who doesn't already know that, I would encourage them to know that that is true. But Christians, people who identify as followers of Christ, oftentimes don't recognize the extent to which that's true. They don't.
Oh, that's a great point. Yeah.
They don't know verses like 2 Timothy 3:16 that says all scripture is breathed out by God and profitable for teaching, for reproof, for correction, and training in righteousness. And so when I think about my company and the positions that we stand on, and so on, and anyone's desire to put themselves in a position to be able to discern what is true and what's not true, you need a firm foundation for that. And for Christians, it is the Word of God. If you study God's Word diligently and thoughtfully and thoroughly, you're going to be in the most discerning position possible. And you're going to be coming from it from this objective place, not a subjective place of, well, I feel like, if it was based on my feelings, I might not want to say that objectively there's only two genders, because I know that'll make some other people upset, and maybe I don't want to be on the backlash of that. But I know it's objectively true, and it's objectively loving to communicate that to people so they don't go down the path of lies of pursuing that lifestyle.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think this is a very good message for the church as well. Like in our lifetime, we have seen the American church get a lot softer on stuff in the interest of being less controversial and being more winsome so that we can win more people, being more relevant to people, reaching out to people, seeing that people are hurting and wanting to be better equipped to reach out to more people. But I really do think that a lot of that was incredibly counterproductive, because when people are struggling with a complete absence of reality, no solid ground to stand on, a softer message is not what they need. They need a really strong lifeline. They need the strongest lifeline that's attached to an actual anchor. And so softening on that message has been a way to offend fewer people, but it's actually been less helpful. And I think that a few people saw that at the time. I remember people talking about it. I think it is so much more obvious now.
Oh, yeah. I think the seeker-friendly model of church was adopted almost hook, line, and sinker by the evangelical Protestant church, and probably other branches as well. But in America, you look at mega churches, and virtually every I say virtually only because it's possible there's some out there that haven't, but I've never seen them. Virtually every mega church is a very heavily seeker-friendly church, and that is the method by which they became a mega church, right? Like the one mega church I attended used to say the goal, the target audience for their Sunday service was the next 100 members of that church, which is theologically a big problem, because the role of the elders is to equip the saints for ministry. Well, if the target audience of your Sunday service, which is the primary gathering of the people of God, if your target audience is the next 100 members of that church, they're not members already, they're not even necessarily believers in Christ, well, you're not actually feeding the sheep as Jesus commanded Peter to do. You're not equipping the saints for ministry. You're trying to attract this other group of people here so that they will theoretically be fed, but then when they get there, you're actually looking at the next 100 and so on and so forth. That's been a detrimental model for the American church and American Christianity, and you're absolutely right. It has failed us, and we need to return from that to a place of more pure, non-sugar coated truth. Now, we can swing too far the other way, just as
for sure.
I would say for the last several decades, American Christianity has emphasized the softer traits of God, his love, his mercy, his grace, his kindness, which are good things that are true about God. But we shouldn't forget his holiness and justice and wrath, his holy wrath. And nor should we swing to the other side and only care about his justice and holiness and wrath to the neglect of his goodness and his holiness and his goodness and his kindness and his mercy and grace, right? We never want to try to block off attributes of God that are not true attributes of his.
Yeah. So getting back to the topic of signals intelligence, if you look at the transmissions, the broadcast, the misinformation, there is so much noise that, analyzing what's out there and trying to come up with the truth, I would say at this point is almost impossible. There's always been an argument, between the people who say the revealed word of Scripture is the only way, and then there's some natural law guys like, no, you can kind of reverse engineer these things by looking at the world. There's always been an element of truth to that in America. There's been so much residual Christianity that you can stumble across these scriptural truths just from the culture that's out there. Right. Ways that people talk in old movies are often more God-honoring than the scriptwriter even intended, just because that's just the world that he grew up in and the audience that he was writing movies for. But we are leaving that residual Christianity pretty far behind and grabbing a hold of the actual transcendent revealed word of God without excuses or without selectiveness is necessary. and proclaiming it is necessary. So that's one of the reasons I wanted to have you on, is to talk about how your watch company does that. But you've already explained the need for absolute truth and the source of absolute truth before we even really had a chance to talk about watches. That's true. I'm glad we went there. I will say, anecdotally, the movie thing you mentioned, we watched the old Disney cartoon Snow White the other night as a family, because I hadn't seen it in years, and the kids either had never seen it or they saw it when they were so young they didn't remember it. And it, as an act of defiance against this new abominable Snow White has come out. And there's a scene in there where Snow White prays. She prays for the dwarves that it's night. She's by her bed praying. Yeah. And you're like, how far have we come? Then that now it's an old movie. It was 1937 when the original Snow White came out, but still, it's like that people used to pray in Disney cartoons. Like how to presumably, I don't know that she said in Jesus' name, amen, but presumably to the triune God, not some spirit. Yeah, that would have. Yeah, I mean, some of those Grimm fairy tales have, I would say, extra biblical superstition to them.
Correct.
But those Grimm's fairy tales come out of a time when paganism was mostly gone, and Christianity was present. So the superstition was the remnants of paganism and clinging to the outsides of Christianity. So I think that would have been the core tenet of the original fairy tale. And then obviously, even in the 1930s in America, even with all the problems of the time, there were already problems in Hollywood by 1930, if you can believe it.
I do.
That was still the assumption that you would do when you would put that in a kids movie. So, I've seen a few headlines about the new Snow White movie, and it's just such an unbelievable, potentially $600 million in the hole at this point, and they're not going to dig themselves out very far. I can't imagine.
It's an encouraging mile marker for our time, though. What is encouraging? It's not encouraging that the movie was made. It would have been better if the Disney executives had recognized the error of their ways earlier on and gone a completely different direction. But
wasted less time, wasted less money, everything.
All those things. But Donald Trump said in his inaugural speech of this term, that we're entering a golden era for America, and I believe that there's a possibility that could be true. I'm open to that possibility, and one of the ultimately, I believe that if America is going to truly enter a lasting golden era, that more Americans need to turn to Christ, and more Christian Americans need to be seriously committed to Christ as their king, right? To really usher in a golden era that lasts. But I think if we do get to see a golden era, part of it would just be a general, more widespread adoption of Christian ideals, of traditional values that are based on Christian principles and biblical truth. And so you could see the widespread rejection of a feminist nonsense Snow White as a move in that direction, and I hope that that's sort of what it's signaling, if I'm being optimistic.
Yeah, I mean, I would hope so, but there is, at the same time, if you build your movies on bad foundations, they are bad movies, and people just don't want to watch them. So it could be that people have there hasn't been a good Disney movie in how long, and people are just tired of it. Yeah. But I'm with you. I'm hoping that it is a rejection of the ideas and not just the quality of the filmmaking, and that we are seeing a more thoughtful and careful return to discernment.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, well, thank you very much for being on the show, Paul. It was a great conversation as always. We have a couple things we're going to be talking about offline, but I'd love to have you back sometime to talk about more scandals. I imagine there'll be some more bad Disney movies. There's definitely some in the pipe. We could continue this conversation. We didn't spend that much time on one of your other projects. So you have the watch company, which is very deliberately, I would say, even almost contentiously Christian.
Yeah.
It's even beyond conscientiously Christian.
Yes.
But you are associated with another group as well.
Yeah, so I'm the Director of Policy for Abolish Abortion Texas, and our goal is to help to establish laws of equal protection under the law for the preborn. Obviously in Texas specifically, but we'd love to see those laws established all across the land. And I'd love to talk, we could do a whole episode or episodes on that very topic, but the high level that I think everyone should understand is abortion is not illegal in any state in the United States. It's restricted in 14 states to a higher degree than it is in others, and that typically you cannot conduct abortions in abortion facilities, but women are still having abortions by the tens and tens of thousands in those states. Very high numbers because of the self-managed abortions that are still legal under their own state laws. And so that's, again, a much bigger topic. But if the average watcher, listener wanted to know about that, I would encourage them to look into that more because there's a lot of work that needs to be done.
100%. And then if the average listener wanted to buy a Wasson watch, could they do so, or do they have to pre-order a watch at this point?
Right now, you need to pre-order one. So we just sold out of our regular Wasson automatic field watches about a week ago. We're doing the version 2 that we're already working on. They will be available. We'll be shipping them probably in June, July, August, maybe as late as September at the very latest. But they are available for pre-order on our website, wassonwatch.com, WASSON watch.com.
Yeah, well, I have appreciated mine as, this kind of goes back a little bit to where we were talking before, but as much as I have enjoyed the features of my Garmin smartwatch, and the part of the reason that we developed the T-Rex Arms Garmin watch face was for me. It is literally the watch face that I wanted. In spite of that, going back to regular mechanical automatic watch has been extremely cool. And so I've appreciated, I think it's been, I forget how long I've had this now, but it's been good getting back to a mechanical watch. So yeah. Something to be said for having fewer electronic devices that gather data on you.
Yeah, I really missed out on an opportunity to plug the watch when you were asking, if there are other ways we could improve our OPSEC or COMSEC earlier. You're throwing me a softball, and I should have been like, well, obviously you need to ditch your smartwatch and go with this analog automatic mechanical watch. But, whatever, missed shot. It is what it is. Next time.
It is. So at some point we should have a watch conversation, and I'm trying to figure out the best way to do that. I also have another watch product that I'm not ready to talk about yet because I haven't figured out how it works or who would make it or if it's worth making or if it's a terrible idea. But we can talk about that offline sometime. Yeah. But once again, Paul, I want to thank you for several things. One, it has been a great watch, and it has been really cool to use the watch as a little bit of a token of trust in in different spots. But also your work in Texas, fighting for the rights of the unborn, and coming on the show and talking about some of these things. I think these are really important issues. Everything from understanding the surveillance apparatus, digital collection apparatus, signals intelligence, data hygiene, stuff like that. But ultimately, ultimate standards. So yeah, thanks for the conversation.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Isaac. It's always a pleasure to talk with you, and I love the content y'all put out, as well as just the work that T-Rex Arms does. It's awesome company. It's really an honor to be associated or affiliated with you guys in any way. So thank you.